versus service mode. But there's also like this completely separate bit, which is normally enabled only by having a certain bit in that chip ID that I mentioned earlier be set. And if that bit is set, then it's considered a trusted or a development device or an engineering device. And it doesn't enforce any of these things I'm about to talk about in the next few slides. The few details, the bootloader in the first gen phone, the NOR sectors are in NOR terminology, they're locked down. So there's actually not only are they not normally erasable, but even if you had the authority to erase them, you'd have to lift a signal on a pin to allow that to go through. It's like an extra lockdown measure. In the first gen phone, the bootloader, and this is important, it's always there in NOR, and it's used, and it's invocable. It's very easy to invoke, actually. And that bootloader itself, and the reason, I don't know if bootloader is an official term or whether it was developed by the community, but it's that bootloader that allows you to go off and program the next stage of the sequence, as long as you pass certain checks. And one of those checks is this next item, the signature check on the firmware. So the bootloader, I don't think 3.9, but 4.6 bootloader in the first gen phone does signature check the firmware. So there is, except for the bootloader itself not being checked, I guess the chain of trust begins at that point. In the second gen phone, unlike the first gen phone, that interactive loader is not there in NOR. It's not permanent. You actually have to upload it. And not only do you have to upload it, it's actually a multi-stage upload. You have to first upload a payload that the boot ROM accepts with one set of keys, and then that, as long as you've got the authority to upload that image will then go off and load a second bootloader with a separate set of keys. So there's this division of trust in this loader over loader protocol. And it also does this signature check of the next stage. That next stage being the firmware. So the firmware is where, everything except for the booting happens in the firmware. So this is where your radio hardware gets set up and the stacks get set up and the SIM starts and the STK starts and everything starts. This is where all the action is. Once the firmware is up and running, which is done with the Nucleus OS, which I mentioned earlier, it's basically, it's the whole program on the phone. The only thing that would bring it out of that operation mode would be a crash or power off or something like that. The firmware can be updated, obviously, and this is, the next few slides are a brief description of that update. You basically reboot the baseband with the control signal, which is easy to do. You ping it, you get it to enter the service mode that I talked about. In the second gen phone, this is where you do that multi-stage loading of the loader itself. So there's the security loader and this RAM loader. But in the first gen phone, it's a lot easier. You just reset it and you just ask it, please go into service mode. At that point, all right, so that's where they differ. At that point, they sort of join up again, and what they do, you basically give these loaders what's called a sec pack that describes, it's a file that's signed by Apple. It's verifiably signed by the bootloader, and it defines what NOR addresses you're allowed to touch, what the signature of the firmware you're about to load is, and so it's a signed package describing what's about to happen. If any of those fields are mutated in any way, the signature fails and whoops. What did I do? Help! Anybody good with OS 10?
Damn you, Google. Google updater for the win.
Why is your Wi-Fi?
Serious. Let's turn the Wi-Fi off.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Okay, if all those things pass, then you send it to firmware, and the bootloader takes care of updating the upper part of the NOR. So here's the chain of trust. I'm going to do it sort of in reverse order. The SIM carrier lock, which if you recall is our ultimate goal, is enforced by the firmware. Definitely do not want to go into the detail here because there's a lot of detail here. But there are basically tables in there that describe to the phone whether the lock even exists, it's tied to those two IDs I mentioned earlier, the chip ID of the S-Gold and the NOR itself. There's T encryption, there's RSA encryption, there's all the stuff that goes on in the what's called the SEC zone. And so this, the only difference between a locked and unlocked phone in the official sense is the tables that are encrypted in the SEC zone. The firmware itself is identical, the baseband is identical, the boot ROM is identical, everything is identical. It's just the SEC zone which is uniquely tied to a given phone's chip ID and NOR ID. That's why you can't just take an officially unlocked phone, somehow copy the firmware over to an unlocked phone, a locked phone, and somehow make it unlocked, because that SEC zone would not verify the bootloader, and the firmware itself would try to decrypt it using that phone's chip ID and NOR ID, and it just would be bogus. It wouldn't recognize it. All right, so continuing with the chain of trust. So the SIM carrier, I'm going back and forth. SIM lock is enforced by the firmware. The firmware is integrity checked by the bootloader. There is a signature there. It's verified by the bootloader. And if that check passes, the bootloader just stops. It doesn't go any, it's basically non-functional. All right, so I'm sorry, I should not keep going back and forth. So this is the check for the existing firmware. The existing firmware will not be run if the integrity check fails, which means that somebody has come in after the fact and changed the NOR on you. There's also the update process, right? So new firmware is verified by the service mode loader, and it's signed with all the usual checks. And then this loader overloader stuff. And here's sort of a similar thing on the S5L side. On the first gen phone, the bootloader, which is that first thing in NOR, it's the first programmable thing that you can actually touch. The bootloader is not integrity checked by the boot ROM, which is that thing that exists in hardware. So there's no integrity check down there. So if you have the means to change the bytes in that NOR for the bootloader, you can basically take control of the baseband. There's only a few checks to see whether or not, maybe there's garbage in the NOR, so there's a few magic value checks, but it's not an integrity check. As opposed to the second gen phone where the boot ROM does a full integrity check of the bootloader. Oh, and this last point is important. Am I running out of time? This last point is important. The boot ROM, after it hands control to the bootloader, almost the first thing the bootloader does, like not even 20 instructions into the sequence, is it maps out the boot ROM, and it maps it out in a way that you can never bring it back without doing a full reset again. And we see to me, what looks like port knocking, which is used to basically tell the boot ROM to never come back. And that's a limitation, and hopefully we'll have time to get into that at the end. Okay, so now onto the exploits. On the first gen phone, there were 2 bootloaders that were published. There were more that were actually existed on that first package that was put out by Apple. But the only 2 that were really in play were this 3.9 and the 4.6. Without boring you, the bugs in 3.9 basically allowed a few things. It allowed you to bypass the SecPack restrictions simply by doing some address manipulation. In other words, the SecPack said you cannot program at this address for this many bytes, but it didn't say that you couldn't start a little bit earlier and then progress right through that previously protected section. So all you had to do was back up where you wanted to write from, write garbage if you wanted to, and then write what you really want to write. So it was just an address bug, basically. There's also this Blankenbacher attack, which is different from this SecPack restriction hack. What it does is that check that's done by the bootloader as to whether the firmware is okay, uses RSA, uses an exponent 3 version of RSA, which is subject to this Blankenbacher attack, which is basically a way to, what? I'm sorry? Which is basically a way to forge the RSA in a way that it looks like it passes to a poor implementation of RSA. And it's interesting because, yay, because this Blankenbacher attack actually comes into play in a few places. Not only does it allow you to forge the firmware, it actually is used in the SEC zone. And this iPhone SIM-free solution, which was the first software solution out there for the first-gen phones, actually used this Blankenbacher attack on the SEC zone to mutate the tokens in a way that they weren't really valid tokens. If you actually use the chip ID and the NOR ID of the phone itself to try to verify these tokens, it would fail. But if you just blindly used RSA on them, it would look like it passed. The end result would look like an unlocked token. Those were the two primary bugs on the 3.9. 4.6 had some different bugs. Allowed you to bypass SecPack restrictions again. The SecPack is a constant nuisance, and anything you can do to get rid of its restrictions is good. There was basically a different version of the -400. Well, I shouldn't say it. There was basically another way to trick the address verification of the SecPack. And the second point is technical. I won't go into it. On the first-gen phone, again, the boot ROM doesn't check the bootloader's integrity. Fake blank, I'll briefly mention this. There was this application we put out called Boot Neuter. It allowed you not only to program 3.9 or 4.6 into your phone, it allowed you to neuter it or to fake blank it. Neutering was a way to basically permanently remove all the SecPack checks on that phone. So it was basically a patch in the bootloader that would forge that bit that I talked about earlier that made it look like a development phone. And we called it neutering, and it would basically take the SecPack completely out of the picture. Fake blank was just a way to have your cake and eat it too. It was a way to allow the phone to normally boot, but if you really wanted to get in there at the low level and give a serial payload before the bootloader has a chance to run, you could actually do both. Normally you wouldn't be able to. The very last sort of exploit that was out there on the first-gen phone was GeriSim. It was basically a SIM card-based hack which allowed code execution, unsigned code execution on the baseband due to a buffer overflow. GeriSim was leaked, and we presumed it to be burned. We presumed it to be lost forever because at the time it was leaked, it was around the time the 3G started to be developed, and there were no further updates to the first-gen firmware. But they had all this time to see what we were exploiting in GeriSim. Am I running out of time? All right, I'm going to speed it up. All right, well, this is the core of what I'm talking about. There are exploits for the second-gen phone. Chain of trust is tough to beat. It's not impossible to beat. It would be possibly easier to beat if we had an image of the boot ROM, but we don't. So for now, we're just going to avoid breaking the chain of trust. We're just going to try to patch the firmware once it's running out of RAM. In a way, it's safer than reflashing NOR. Reflashing NOR has a bunch of risks that are usually user-related. If the user does something at the wrong time, they can put the phone into this permanent brick mode that I talked about. This doesn't have that risk. There are two parts to it. There are two parts to the soft unlock. There's the unlocking code itself, which is your payload. It's your ultimate payload. It's what you want to get into the running firmware and allow it to coexist with the running firmware. And basically what you do is you reprogram the firmware. While it's in RAM, you basically change the decision tree that would normally take place about whether a SIM that's just been inserted should be allowed to operate. The actual, sort of the development of the unlocking code takes a little bit more initial investment because you have to sort of understand more about what Apple has intended in the firmware. That's the downside, but once you've got that work out of the way, the unlock code itself, the principle that the unlock uses is reusable over and over again as the firmware changes.